25th, 1876, along the banks of the Little Bighorn River in Montana, the U.S. 7th Cavalry met its destruction. In just a few hours, more than 200 soldiers, including Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, were wiped out to the last man. Americans would remember it as Custer's last stand. But beyond the legend lies something deeper. A case study in failed intelligence, divided leadership, and tactical mistakes that turned a proud regiment into a cautionary tale. By the summer of 1876, the U.S. Army's 7th Cavalry was on campaign in Montana. Their mission was simple in words, but dangerous in reality: locate and force native tribes back onto their reservations. Custer's regiment numbered just under 600 men. These were experienced cavalry troopers organized into companies, but they were not
Prepare
fresh.
to move!
They had been marching hard for weeks, moving across rough terrain, often on limited rations. Fatigue already weighed on both men and horses before the battle even began. Their primary weapon was the Springfield Model 1873 carbine. It was sturdy, accurate, and standard issue for the cavalry. But it came with one crippling flaw: it was a single-shot weapon.
We will divide
After
our forces,
each round, a
sweep
soldier
down the
had to
valley,
manually
and
reload.
strike with overwhelming
Under the stress
speed.
of battle, a trooper might fire only 6 to 8 shots per minute. At close range, many carried Colt revolvers, which gave more rapid fire, but only for a few seconds before
Prepare to
reloading.
advance.
Against this stood a native coalition, unlike anything the U.S. Army had yet faced. Lakota, Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors gathered in one of the largest encampments ever seen on the plains. Estimates range from 1,500 to 2,500 warriors, not counting the women and children inside the camp. Their weapons were diverse. Some still carried bows and lances, which they used with deadly skill from horseback. Many, however, now had firearms, captured rifles from earlier battles, trade guns, and crucially repeating rifles like the Winchester. A Winchester could fire up to 15 shots before reloading, delivering 3 to 4 times the rate of fire of a cavalryman's single-shot Springfield. In a close engagement, that difference in firepower was decisive. Beyond weapons, the warriors fought on their own ground. They were defending their families and their way of life. Their morale was higher, their numbers greater, and their horses strong and fresh. Custer, however, did not believe the camp contained more than 800 to 1,000 fighting men. Faulty reconnaissance and overconfidence led him to underestimate his opponent by nearly half. This was error number 1, the foundation on which all his later mistakes were built. When a commander misreads the enemy's numbers, every decision afterward is compromised. Tactics designed for a small camp of 800 would fail against a force of 2,000. In military terms, this was not just a mistake, it was a fatal miscalculation that shaped everything that followed at the Little Bighorn. After locating the native encampment, Custer faced a critical choice: how to deploy his 600 men against what he believed to be a force of no more than 1,000 warriors. Instead of holding his regiment together, he made a decision that would define the battle. Custer divided the 7th Cavalry into 3 separate detachments. Major Marcus Reno received about 140 men and was ordered to attack the southern end of the village head-on. Captain Frederick Benteen took 125 men and was sent westward, tasked with scouting the bluffs and blocking any escape routes. Custer himself kept roughly 210 men, planning to swing north and strike the upper end of the camp. On paper, this was a classic pincer maneuver. By hitting the encampment from multiple directions, Custer hoped to create panic, scatter the enemy, and capture women and children to force a surrender. It was a bold plan, but it was also reckless because it violated one of the oldest rules of warfare: never divide your force in the face of an enemy whose strength you cannot measure. The problems became clear almost immediately. The distances between the 3 columns were too great. Once they separated, they lost sight of each other, and with the broken terrain of bluffs, coulees, and river bends, they could not easily communicate. Signal flags and bugles were useless in the confusion of battle and across miles of uneven ground. What Custer imagined as a coordinated strike became three independent actions with no ability to support one another. This fragmentation meant that instead of one force of 600 men, the regiment was now reduced to three much smaller groups. Each of these groups was vulnerable, each could be surrounded, and each would be forced to fight alone. The native coalition fighting on home ground, and able to mass quickly, could now confront and overwhelm each detachment one at a time. This decision also ignored the condition of the men themselves. Fatigued from marching short on supplies and lacking reliable intelligence about the size of the village, they were in no position to conduct a complex maneuver. A single strong strike or even a decision to wait for reinforcements from Terry and Gibbon's columns only a day away might have preserved the regiment. Instead, Custer's choice to divide his command sealed their fate. In military analysis, this was error number 2. The regiment, already disadvantaged by faulty reconnaissance, was now weakened further by its own commander. Dividing forces in such terrain with no reliable communication and no accurate estimate of enemy numbers was not simply a risk. It was an invitation to disaster. By breaking his regiment apart, Custer handed the initiative to his opponents. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho leaders would not face one large cavalry attack. They would instead face three smaller, isolated targets, and in each case the balance of power would favor the defenders. This was not just a tactical miscalculation. It was a fundamental error in judgment. And it meant that when the fighting began in earnest, the 7th Cavalry would no longer be fighting as one regiment, but as three small detachments alone against a force they had already underestimated. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was not fought on open fields where cavalry could maneuver freely. It was fought in a broken valley landscape that turned the land itself into a weapon against the 7th Cavalry. The Little Bighorn River winds through Montana in sharp bends and meanders. Along its banks rise bluffs and ridgelines with deep coulees, dry ravines that cut into the earth. Rolling hills limit visibility. What looks like open ground on a map becomes a maze once you ride into it. For cavalry, which relies on speed coordination and clear lines of sight, this terrain was a nightmare. Custer had allies who understood this. Crow and Arikara scouts traveled with the 7th Cavalry and repeatedly warned him that the encampment ahead was massive and that the ground was dangerous. Their warnings were direct. The valley was too wide, the enemy too strong, and the chances of surprise too small. Custer ignored them. He pressed forward, believing speed and aggression would deliver victory, but the terrain canceled out his advantages. Signals by bugle or flag could not carry across miles of ridges and ravines. Once divided, his three detachments lost sight of one another. There was no way to know where Reno was, no way for Benteen to find Custer, no way for Custer to call for help once the fighting began. Coordination, which had been risky on paper, became impossible on the ground. For the native warriors, the same terrain offered every advantage. Bluffs and coulees provided natural concealment. Small groups could appear suddenly from behind a ridge, strike, and vanish again. They could block escape routes with little effort, using bends in the river to cut off retreat. Most importantly, the broken landscape allowed swarm tactics, attacking from multiple directions, at once disorienting an enemy that could not see where the next charge would come from. What the U.S. cavalry saw as a battlefield was to the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho home ground. They knew every ridge, every gully, every crossing. Custer's men were strangers in a landscape that was already stacked against them. In military terms, this was not just an unfortunate setting. It was a force multiplier. The terrain amplified every other mistake. Dividing the regiment became even more disastrous when detachments could not even see each other. Faulty reconnaissance became fatal when the enemy could use cover to mask their true numbers. Once again, local intelligence had been offered, and once again it was ignored. This was error number 3. By dismissing the warnings of his own scouts and underestimating the role of terrain, Custer walked his regiment into a battlefield designed to neutralize cavalry and empower defenders. The land itself became the invisible enemy, and when the fighting began, it was the native warriors who exploited the terrain with precision, while Custer's regiment stumbled through it blind and divided. June 25, 1876. The sun rose hot over the Montana plains, and Custer's divided regiment moved into position against what he still believed was a smaller encampment. The reality waiting for them was far larger and far deadlier. Just after noon, Major Marcus Reno led his detachment of about 140 men into the valley. Their orders were to strike the southern end of the native village. At first, the charge looked promising. Reno's men dismounted and formed a skirmish line, firing volleys that forced the first defenders back. It seemed for a brief moment that Custer's plan of surprise might succeed, but within minutes the situation changed. Hundreds of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors surged out of the village, riding hard toward Reno's line. They outflanked his position with speed and confidence. Reno's men held for only a short time before panic began to spread. Instead of reinforcing his line, Reno ordered a retreat into the timber along the riverbank. There, his command hesitated, confused and fearful, while the warriors pressed closer. Then Reno made a fateful choice. He abandoned the timber position, a defensible spot, and ordered his men to retreat across the Little Bighorn River. What followed was chaos. The retreat turned into a rout. Warriors charged directly into the fleeing soldiers, cutting them down in the water and on the opposite bank. By the time Reno's shattered command regrouped on the far bluffs, around 40 of his men were dead. The southern strike, the first arm of Custer's pincer, had collapsed in less than an hour. While Reno was reeling, Custer advanced north with his 210 men. Unaware of Reno's defeat, he pushed toward the northern end of the encampment. His target was not warriors, but the families inside, women, children, and the elderly. His strategy was brutal, but calculated. By striking at the non-combatants, he believed the warriors would be forced to abandon the fight to protect their loved ones. Instead, the opposite happened. The move enraged the Lakota and Cheyenne. Gall, a Hunkpapa Lakota leader, rallied men from the village and directed them toward Custer's column. Crazy Horse, the Oglala. Lakota war chief, mounted his warriors and charged north with remarkable speed. In minutes, hundreds of fighters were converging on Custer's line of advance. The cavalry had walked directly into the jaws of the counterattack. By mid-afternoon, Custer's battalion was trapped on a series of ridges overlooking the valley. They attempted to form defensive firing lines, dismounting from their horses and using what cover they could find. Soldiers fired their Springfield carbines in volleys, but the weapons reloaded too slowly to hold back the swarming attacks. Each trooper could manage perhaps 6 shots per minute, while many warriors armed with Winchesters and other repeaters fired 3 or 4 times faster. Ammunition was limited. Supply packs were too far away, and resupply under fire was impossible. The warriors closed in from every side. Some fired from cover at long range. Others charged in waves, forcing the cavalry to shift positions again and again. Custer tried to maneuver along the ridges, but each move was blocked. Every coulee, every rise in the ground, concealed more warriors. The cavalrymen were no longer attackers. They were a cornered force fighting simply to survive. As the pressure mounted, Custer and the remnants of his command fell back to a final position, a small hill that would later be called Last Stand Hill. Surrounded on all sides with no reinforcements in sight, they fought in desperate clusters. Officers and enlisted men alike fired until their cartridges were gone, then drew revolvers or knives for the last moments. Accounts from native warriors describe the scene: soldiers crouched together, horses shot down to form makeshift barricades, volleys slowing then stopping altogether. When it was over, silence fell on the ridgeline. Custer and all 210 of his men lay dead. There were no survivors from his battalion. The northern strike had been destroyed to the last man. South of the carnage, Major Reno and Captain Benteen had managed to consolidate their forces on the bluffs after Reno's disastrous retreat. Around 300 soldiers dug in on the high ground, forming a defensive perimeter. For nearly 2 days, they endured repeated assaults, sharp shooting, and even the burning of the grass around them. Food and water were scarce, morale was low, but this time the position held. By the evening of June 26th, reinforcements under General Terry and Colonel Gibbon finally reached the battlefield. The native forces, unwilling to fight larger numbers, had already withdrawn. The toll was devastating. Out of roughly 600 men, the 7th Cavalry had lost about 268 killed and more than 50 wounded. Nearly half the regiment had been wiped out. For the native coalition, casualties were far lighter, perhaps between 30 and 100 killed, though exact numbers remain uncertain. The day had begun with a confident plan for a pincer attack. It ended with the 7th Cavalry shattered, its commander dead, and its reputation scarred forever. The timeline of June 25th shows how quickly Custer's plan unraveled: a failed southern attack, a reckless northern advance, and finally a complete annihilation. By nightfall, the U.S. Army had suffered one of the worst defeats in its history. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was not decided by Custer alone. 2 of his officers, Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, made critical choices that shaped the fate of the 7th Cavalry. Reno began with a strong position. After his initial charge faltered, he pulled his men into the timber along the river. It was a defensible line shaded by trees with natural cover and proximity to water. From this position, he could have delayed the warriors, bought time for Custer to maneuver, and held the southern end of the fight. Instead, Reno lost his nerve. Faced with growing pressure, he ordered a retreat across the Little Bighorn River. But the retreat was rushed, chaotic, and poorly executed. Soldiers broke formation, many threw down equipment, and discipline collapsed. Warriors pursued them into the water, cutting down dozens in the crossing. By the time Reno's men reached the bluffs, at least 40 had been killed, and the survivors were shaken. The retreat not only cost lives, it shattered morale. Soldiers who had seen their comrades drown or fall under arrows and bullets were in no state to regroup quickly. Reno's failure to hold the timberline transformed a tactical setback into a full collapse. While Reno's men reeled, Captain Frederick Benteen was riding with his own detachment of about 125 men on the western flank. Around this time, a courier reached him with one of the most urgent orders in U.S. military history, a hastily written note from Custer himself. "Come quick, bring packs." The meaning was clear. Custer needed reinforcements and ammunition. He was engaged with the enemy and expected support. But Benteen did not move quickly. He advanced at a measured pace, and when he heard the sounds of heavy firing from the north, he did not ride toward it. Instead, he chose to rejoin Reno's shattered force on the bluffs. This decision saved part of the regiment. With Reno and Benteen together, nearly 300 soldiers could form a stronger defensive perimeter, one that held out until reinforcements arrived the following day. But it also doomed Custer. By failing to push north, Benteen left Custer's 210 men isolated. No reinforcements came. No resupply arrived. When the fighting reached its climax on Last Stand Hill, Custer's battalion faced annihilation alone. In theory, Custer's 3 wings, his own Reno's and Benteen's, were meant to strike together a coordinated assault that might overwhelm the encampment. In reality, Reno collapsed. Benteen hesitated and Custer overreached. The regiment was no longer one unit. It had become 3 disconnected fragments. 1 fragment was destroyed outright. 2 barely survived. And the 7th Cavalry, a regiment of 600, had been reduced to little more than a remnant in less than 2 days. The mistakes of Reno and Benteen reveal a deeper truth about command. In battle, leadership under pressure is as decisive as numbers or weapons. Reno had the ground, but lost his will. Benteen had the chance to act but moved too cautiously. Together, their errors reinforced Custer's own misjudgments and sealed the fate of the 7th Cavalry. On the surface, Custer's plan was straight out of the cavalry handbook. The doctrine of the 19th century emphasized shock speed and divided assaults. Columns were expected to strike from multiple angles to break the enemy's cohesion and force a rout. In European battlefields or against smaller tribal bands, such tactics had worked before. But at the Little Bighorn doctrine met reality. The terrain was broken communication unreliable, and the enemy far stronger than expected. Custer's rigid adherence to textbook tactics became a weakness. His divided assault scattered his strength, and his reliance on speed meant nothing once coordination collapsed. Doctrine did not adapt to circumstance. The native coalition fought differently. Their tactics were not rigid formations, but fluid, flexible swarms. Small groups of warriors attacked from multiple directions, encircling detachments, retreating and reappearing, pressing the fight wherever the cavalry's line looked weakest. They used the ridges and coulees as cover, striking from angles the soldiers could not see. This was not random or chaotic. Leaders like Crazy Horse and Gall coordinated these movements, directing charges and counterattacks with skill. The result was a pattern of constant pressure, wearing down the cavalry's firepower until the lines broke. The swarm was faster, more adaptive, and perfectly suited to the terrain. In the end, it was rigidity versus adaptability. Custer clung to doctrine, expecting it to succeed, regardless of the ground or the enemy's strength. The Lakota and Cheyenne adapted to every change, using flexibility as their doctrine. When the two approaches collided, adaptability triumphed. The lesson was stark. A regiment bound by outdated methods was no match for warriors who turned the battlefield into an extension of their own home ground. Numbers and tactics mattered at the Little Bighorn, but the battle was also shaped by something less visible: the psychology of the men fighting it. Morale, the will to fight, proved to be just as decisive as weapons or numbers. For the U.S. 7th Cavalry morale was already fragile before the first shot was fired. The regiment had been on a grueling march for weeks, crossing rough terrain with limited supplies. Horses were tired, men were hungry, and discipline had frayed at the edges. When leadership faltered, Reno's panic, Custer's overconfidence, Benteen's hesitation, the soldiers' confidence eroded even further. A tired army led by uncertain commanders rarely fights at its best. The native warriors, by contrast, carried the strongest possible motivation. They were not fighting a distant campaign. They were defending their families who were inside the camp only a short ride away. Every man who rode out to meet the cavalry did so knowing that his children, his parents, and his way of life were directly at risk. That kind of commitment cannot be taught in drill or training. It comes from the deepest sense of duty and survival. Eyewitness accounts describe the intensity of their charges, the fearlessness with which they closed in on the cavalry lines. Warriors knew that if they broke, their families would pay the price. That knowledge fueled them to press harder, to endure losses, and to keep attacking until the enemy was destroyed. The contrast was stark. The cavalry fought tired, divided, and shaken by leadership mistakes. The native warriors fought with unity, urgency, and total commitment. In military history, morale is often described as a force multiplier. At the Little Bighorn, it was the factor that tipped the balance. The lesson is clear. Formal training, drill, and discipline may give an army structure, but psychological will, the motivation to fight, can outweigh them all. At Little Bighorn, the 7th Cavalry had doctrine and training. The Lakota and Cheyenne had conviction, and conviction proved stronger. Leadership often decides battles as much as weapons or numbers. At the Little Bighorn, the 7th Cavalry suffered not from a single poor decision, but from the clash of three flawed leadership styles. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer embodied overconfidence. He had built his reputation on bold charges and aggressive tactics, and he believed speed and audacity could overcome any obstacle. That mindset led him to underestimate his enemy, ignore the warnings of his scouts, and reject coordination with nearby U.S. forces under General Terry and Colonel Gibbon. Reinforcements were less than a day's march away, but Custer chose not to wait. His impatience cost his regiment the strength of combined arms. Major Marcus Reno showed the opposite flaw: indecision under pressure. When faced with overwhelming numbers, he abandoned a defensible timber position and ordered a chaotic retreat across the river. His men lost cohesion, morale collapsed, and nearly 40 were cut down during the withdrawal. Instead of stabilizing one arm of the battle, Reno's panic destabilized it. Captain Frederick Benteen leaned toward caution. When Custer sent the urgent note, "Come quick! Bring packs!" Benteen moved slowly. He heard the roar of heavy fighting to the north, but chose to consolidate with Reno rather than ride hard to Custer's support. His decision saved part of the regiment, but it left Custer isolated. Taken together, these three styles, overconfidence, indecision, and overcaution, clashed fatally. There was no unified command rhythm, no balance between aggression and defense. Instead, the regiment fractured along the same lines as its leaders. Military history is filled with examples where strong leadership turned the tide against the odds. At Little Bighorn, the reverse was true. Leadership failed, and the 7th Cavalry disintegrated not just in the field, but in its chain of command. Numbers often speak more clearly than words. At the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the casualty figures revealed just how one-sided the fighting became. For the U.S. 7th Cavalry, the toll was catastrophic. Out of roughly 600 men, 268 were killed outright. Another 55 were wounded. Nearly half the regiment was lost in less than 2 days of fighting. Entire companies disappeared from the rolls, their officers and troopers buried together on the ridgelines. On Last Stand Hill alone, over 200 men were wiped out to the last soldier. For the Native coalition, losses were far lighter. Exact numbers remain uncertain, oral traditions, and U.S. Army estimates differ, but most historians place the figure somewhere between 30 and 100 warriors killed. Even at the high end, that number is a fraction of the devastation suffered by the cavalry. The ratio is striking. For every Native warrior who fell, at least 3 and perhaps as many as 8 U.S. soldiers were killed. In military terms, this lopsided exchange rate highlights the effectiveness of Native tactics and the depth of cavalry errors. The warriors were able to maximize their strengths, mobility, firepower from repeating rifles, and knowledge of the terrain while exploiting every weakness of their opponents. Casualties also shaped morale and legacy. For the U.S. Army, the loss of so many officers and men was a national shock, a humiliation that demanded explanation and retribution. For the Lakota and Cheyenne, the comparatively light toll reinforced their confidence in battle and their belief in the justice of their cause. The numbers show what the narrative makes clear. At the Little Bighorn, the cavalry was not simply defeated. It was outmaneuvered, outfought, and overwhelmed. And the casualty ledger records the cost of those failures with brutal clarity. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho a stunning tactical triumph. On June 25, 1876, they had not only defeated a U.S. regiment, but annihilated it. For a brief moment, the Plains tribes stood victorious, their warriors celebrated, and their families safe. But that triumph was short-lived. The shock in Washington was immediate. News of Custer's defeat spread quickly, and the reaction was one of outrage and determination. What had begun as a campaign against a few thousand Native families now became a national crusade. Congress authorized more troops, supplies, and resources. The U.S. Army surged into the plains in overwhelming numbers. Within a year, the consequences were clear. The Lakota and Cheyenne, who had won at the Little Bighorn, were pursued relentlessly. Villages were attacked in winter food supplies. destroyed, and bison herds. The foundation of their economy were driven to near extinction. One by one, bands of warriors surrendered, forced back onto reservations, under terms dictated by the government. In military terms, Little Bighorn illustrates the difference between tactical and strategic success. On the battlefield, the native coalition fought brilliantly and won decisively. But strategically, the victory brought a massive and unsustainable response. The United States could absorb one defeat, even a humiliating one. The tribes, however, could not withstand a sustained national campaign. The lesson's clear. Tactical victories can shape battles. Strategic outcomes decide wars. At the Little Bighorn, the Lakota and Cheyenne proved their strength, but in the long run, the defeat of Custer accelerated the destruction of their independence. The Battle of the Little Bighorn offers lessons that extend far beyond the 19th century. For military historians and modern commanders alike, its failures remain a cautionary guide. First, never divide your force against an enemy whose numbers are uncertain. Custer split 600 men into 3 wings, only to see each isolated and destroyed in turn. Concentration of strength would have given him a chance. Fragmentation guaranteed defeat. Second, secure communication and coordination before attempting complex maneuvers. Bugles and flags could not carry across ridges and coulees. Without reliable signals, Reno, Benteen, and Custer fought 3 separate battles instead of 1. Third, respect terrain and enemy adaptability. The broken ground of the Little Bighorn neutralized cavalry doctrine, while the Lakota and Cheyenne used it as a weapon. Ignoring the warnings of local scouts magnified this mistake. And fourth, leadership cohesion is as vital as troop numbers. Overconfidence, indecision, and overcaution clashed within the 7th Cavalry's command. Without unity at the top, unity in the ranks collapsed. Custer's regiment did not fail for lack of bravery. It failed because these principles were ignored. And history records the cost: a regiment destroyed, a reputation ruined, and a legend born out of defeat. The Battle of the Little Bighorn remains one of the most famous clashes in American history. An American disaster, a native triumph, and an enduring legend. But beyond the myths, it stands as a clear case study in military failure, poor intelligence, broken leadership, and tactics that could not adapt to ground or enemy. The final lesson is timeless. Overconfidence and miscalculation can destroy even the most seasoned units, turning bold plans into ruin. If you found value in this analysis, subscribe for more deep-dive military case studies where history's defeats still teach modern lessons.